I recently did a video on the Neo Geo CD where I put the question, was it really as bad as many claimed it to be in regards to load times? After looking at a bunch of games, I determined that it greatly depended on the games you intended to play. Most of the early stuff and games from genres that weren't fighting games were perfectly fine and load times weren't much of an issue at all. It was only when you popped in fighting games, particularly the ones released later in the console's life, that load times became nearly unbearable. In that same episode, I very deliberately avoided talking about the Neo Geo CDZ because I wanted to give it its own time to shine. That time is now, and we will be looking at the Neo Geo CDZ versus a standard top loader and see if it truly deserves its reputation as being a much better option. I've chosen 17 titles to test, and we'll be comparing them real time to see the differences. I won't sugarcoat it, you are about to see a video about load times, but I've done my best to cut away all the fluff and jump to each comparison as efficiently and as quickly as possible. Hope you guys enjoy how much better was the Neo Geo CDZ. The first thing you'll notice when firing up the CDZ is that it has its own unique startup animation, different from the previous models. The CDZ also launches straight into the game, whereas before you always had to start the game from the CD player on the dashboard. Our first test subject is Baseball Stars Professional, a game that really only ever loaded once per game anyway. We also see that the load screen is different on the CDZ, and it's clearly faster. This one wasn't a problem on the original top loader, but it is nice to see it perform better regardless. Our next game is Cyberlip, another game that didn't have any loading issues thanks to most of it loading up in the initial boot. Again, the CDZ is faster, and every little bit helps. I want to test these older game releases first to show you how things work across various genres. League Bowling was another one that loads up in one go at the beginning, and the CDZ burns rubber past the top loader here as well. Once the loading is done, you never see it again. Magician Lord also loads much of the game in the beginning, and though the top loader does it fine, the CDZ again shows its advantages clear as day. Ninja Combat is our last test entry for the early batch of games that didn't really have loading issues before, but we're gonna test it here just to set the stage for how things are gonna progress. The CDZ has performed admirably so far, and it blows away the top loader yet again, but we have a lot more games to go over that will stress that faster CD-ROM, so let's get right to it. Fighting games are of course a big question mark for the CDZ and how it performs, so for that reason we are going to start with a few oldies but goodies to see how things go. Art of Fighting wasn't really that awful before on the top loader, but the CDZ shreds the opening load screen with a clear advantage. It was also much faster in the in-between fighting loads, again with a very notable speed increase. Samurai Showdown marks the point when Neo Geo fighting games really started to grow in size, and it was here that the top loader began to show its disadvantages in the last video. The CDZ, on the other hand, blew through it as fast as any Saturn or PlayStation fighting game. It's a great showing that will hopefully continue. Sengoku 2 was a side-scrolling beat-em-up that had a bunch of little loading pauses during the game rather frequently on the top loader. Not only did the CDZ improve the initial loading and loading between levels, but it also made the scene transitions noticeably faster. So much so that I barely even feel it now. Metal Slug wasn't really an issue on the top loader because the levels were long enough to where you didn't see the loading very often. The CDZ does it even better, however, making quick work of both the opening boot loading as well as the loading in between stages. As we get deeper into the library, it's clear that the faster CDZ is starting to make some real headway in improving upon some of the games that had real issues. When I originally took a look at my favorite game on the Neo Geo, I decided that the cartridge version was the way to play it. On the CD version, even with its added content, it just loaded far too frequently. The CDZ virtually eliminates this conclusion, and now elevates Neo Turfmaster CD as the version to play if you choose to use the CDZ to play it. The frequent loading is minimized greatly thanks to the faster drive. You can nearly finish a course by the time the top loader gets you into the match to hit your very first ball. Our last test for this section falls to Polestar, the R-Type inspired horizontal shooter that had great visuals and awesome animation. The CDZ again demonstrates its superiority by crushing the opening and getting you right into the game with a much more manageable stage load. I'll leave you with a real-time comparison so you can see the difference. Our last batch of test subjects are all games that were real pains on the top loader. Games where the loading was so slow, you really had a tough time dealing with it. The first up is Breakers, a Street Fighter II clone that I really enjoyed on the Neo Geo. As before, the CDZ is a clear cut above the top loader, both in the boot loading and in between each fight. As the games have gotten bigger, the extra speed the CDZ provides has become more and more noticeable. With some of these games going in excess of a minute or more of loading, shaving off 10 to 20 seconds makes a huge difference. This becomes more evident in titles like Samurai Showdown 4, which just had terrible load times on the top loader. As you can see here, the CDZ boots faster, loads faster in between fights, and makes this so much better of an experience. As a matter of fact, let's throw in a Sega Saturn loading example for comparison. Yep, you are seeing that right. The CDZ is nearly as fast as the RAM cart supporting Saturn edition. The same is true for Real Bout Fatal Fury 2. This is such a great game and beautiful to boot, but the top loader was quite slow getting you into the game. The CDZ helps a lot, easily blasting through the opening and in between fights loading a good 30% faster. It's the kind of difference that makes the top loader hard to stomach for an entire playthrough, while the CDZ is much more tolerable. Originally, Metal Slug 2 had loading at the beginning and middle of the stages, which I don't mind telling you really sucked. But here, the CDZ again rescues the experience. That loading is still there, of course, but the CDZ makes quick work of it. Our next test is one that you see a lot of here on YouTube. The Last Blade 2 doesn't just have long load times, but they're frequent as well, making this one pretty much a lost cause on the top loader for all but the most patient individuals. Unfortunately, while the CDZ does improve these load times significantly, they are still so often it just crushes your will to sit through it after a few fights. I mean, this thing needs loading just for the opening introductions. This is also the case for our final test, the King of Fighters 98. It was here that on the top loader, it had to load in between every single round. Yeah man, not every fight, I mean every damn round. This made getting through a full set of stages and a final boss a slog I just couldn't do, and again, the CDZ fails to change this. It isn't for lack of trying, as the CDZ is clearly faster. It's just that this loading for every round is too often, still too long, and just doesn't work for a fast-paced arcade title. The CDZ was a capable and much improved product to be certain, but it wasn't a miracle worker, and these later releases still hammered your patience. So what's the final verdict for the old CDZ here? Is it the godsend you have been led to believe? The answer is again, it really depends on what you want to use the Neo Geo CD for. Like the top loader, it's great for older games released in the first few years of the console's life. If you want to fire up something like NAM 75 or Super Spy, the CDZ loads them so fast you never really see a load screen to fret over. It's also a solid choice for many of the games, including fighters, right up to about Samurai Showdown 4. Load times are markedly improved in all of these, and give you a much better overall experience. Where the CDZ begins to falter is also where the top loader fell to pieces, the later released fighters. You pop in something like The Last Blade, King of Fighters 98 or 99, and Art of Fighting 3, and you are faced with the reality that no CD-based console of that time was gonna do well with these games. The load times remain long, frequent, and crush any desire to deal with a full play session. In something like Art of Fighting 3, the developers even shrunk the sprites down to mitigate some of the data needed to be loaded, giving you a much less impressive visual experience than the cartridge-based options. SNK wasn't above cutting back animation frames in some of these later released fighters as well. That leaves us with the reality that no version of the Neo Geo CD was a perfect choice for every person. The CDZ is most certainly the best of these options, and if you ever want to own original hardware or collect for it, it's gonna be the one most of you are gonna want. But with modern emulation being so close, and FPGA kits offering much faster loading itself, it's tough not to choose one of those routes today. I think on paper the Neo Geo CD was a brilliant idea. SNK essentially removed the one barrier most people had for buying a Neo Geo, the cost of the games. But in practice, the reality was things were much more difficult to execute. As Neo Geo cartridge games grew in size, their CD variants began to suffer. It became clear fairly quickly that the concessions needed to keep these monster cartridges playable on the Neo Geo CD were just too much. By the time the King of Fighters 98 and The Last Blade 2 came around, not even the CDZ could keep up. For those of you that don't give a damn about load times or have a modern solution that speeds things up, the Neo Geo CD does have a silver lining. Many of these games have remixed soundtracks that are worth a listen, and many more have additional content worth exploring, such as an extra course in Neo Turf Masters. Finally, while the CDZ doesn't have any built-in copy protection, it does have the ability to tell if some games are on a CDR. I'll spare you the tech side of it and just say this: if you have a CDZ, make sure your game images are patched for it. Otherwise, it's not gonna work. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.